Welcome back to the Automation Podcast, the world's #1 industrial automation product and technology show. Thanks to you, our audience of highly skilled automation professionals. Thank you for being a member of our audience, and thank you for tuning back in this week. Now, for those new to the show, my name is Shawn Tierney of Insights in Automation, and each week I invite a new vendor to come on the show to talk to us about products and technologies. And during their presentation, I play the role of the audience, asking questions I think you might have, as well as I add my own comments and questions based on my experience. Now, given that over a quarter of our audience listens to the show, I will try to call attention to any details in the visuals I think you listen-only folks may want to know about. With that said, it is my pleasure to welcome Adam back to the show from Copia, along with Nick, who's making his first time appearance here. These guys got something really exciting to talk about. And so with that, let me just turn it over to you, Adam. In case somebody hasn't watched our previous episodes, could you please introduce yourself to our audience and then pass it over to Nick so he can introduce himself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, thank you again for having us. And I think this is now the third major product launch we've done on your show. So thank you for having us throughout those. And we're really excited to share what we've been building internally. My background is, my name is Adam Gluck. I'm CEO and founder at Copia Automation. We founded Copia, 4 years ago, actually started working around 5 years ago, in order to transform the workflows for controls and industrial engineers, increase efficiency, increase productivity, increase quality, and ultimately reduce downtime and build better production. So we're super excited to share some of our vision here and walk through some of the stuff we've been working on. So I'll hand it over to Nick Buckley, who's a product manager on the team. Also, I'll call out one fun data point is he's also one of the very early Copia users. So he used our product in the alpha and has since joined the company and over time worked his way into being a product leader here. So I'll hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Shawn, for having us on the podcast today. Like Adam mentioned, I was an early user of Copia back in my previous role as a controls engineer. And now at Copia, I'm a technical product manager, focusing on our source control team and our vendor integrations. I'll give a little bit more background about my history and experience a little bit later on in the podcast, but for now, I'll turn it back over to Adam.
Cool. So yeah, so we view, and obviously this conversation is about artificial intelligence and the product we're launching there. We view this as kind of another piece of our overall vision. And so for people who are not familiar with Copia, we're going to lead through how we think about industrial DevOps as an initial step. And then I'll hand over to Nick and he'll demo the new product that we're launching and kind of walk through some of the use cases that we're starting to see within artificial intelligence. Before we jump into that, AI is a buzzword. Our culture is, I would say, maybe an anti-buzzword culture internally at Copia. So we put a lot of thought into this before we kind of adopt it and start building this sort of product. And one big piece, and you'll see this in the examples that Nick will bring up later, is really thinking about what are the workflows of engineers working really closely with our customers. We're extremely customer-centric and product-centric as a business. About 60 to 70% of our headcount goes towards product engineering and enablement, so working closely with customers. And making sure that we are building something that is actually valuable. And so as Nick kind of goes through, he'll also be talking through, how we saw these kind of use cases for AI play out. And hopefully this can kind of contribute to the conversation. So we'll go through Copia at a glance. We'll talk about the overall problem of industrial DevOps, our current platform today. We'll walk through our AI for industrial code and this kind of way in which AI impacts industrial DevOps in the same way that we believe that it's impacted software engineering more generally, and then where we've seen success thus far with Copia. So Copia at a glance, as I mentioned, we were founded in 2020. We started shipping product to users in early 2021. One of those users was Nick, and since 2020, we've raised roughly $30 million of funding from top investors. We've seen consistent growth in adoption, resulting in 2,000 developers from 135 customers globally. Our team is this combination of IT and OT from a variety of companies in the industrial space and in the software space. And then, our platform in general, and again, this focus on customer centricity has demonstrated best-in-class stickiness, really high user satisfaction, consistent growth, and product engagement. And this is something we also view ourselves as bringing to the market as this, incredible user-centric approach to developing product and building out, a solution that really delivers value to our customers. So the core problem, as we view it, is trillions of dollars of global production distribution rely on workflows that are broken. And so if you're a controls engineer in your day-to-day life, you're dealing with a variety of different environments that's hard to build a consistent workflow over. So you see proprietary file types, bespoke protocols, really opaque interfaces. Physical file sharing is still, even today, probably the most common way that we see customers share their files. So that is on a CD or a USB or something like that. Marginal testing. So we see that, basically people test in production. One kind of joke that I often tell is we talk to a company that produces industrial scale water slides. And they said that they test by going down the slide, but we see that oftentimes people are not using tools like automate testing, emulators, et cetera, and then overall limited visibility into their production environment. I think when you look at this, another lens you can use is to look at industrial productivity. We saw in the late 20th century that industrial productivity it went up consistently over time and continued into the early 21st century. But over the last 15 years, we actually haven't seen productivity within the industrial space in North America grow. And so one of our big visions is, how do we make it so that people can scale production? How can we create more industrial automation? How do we make it so that there's a wider scale and scope of industrial production? And so we see increasingly through people using industrial DevOps and our tools, hyper-focused teams operating at a scale that they couldn't operate at before. And we see people being able to centralize their controls teams and achieve better standardization and better scale overall, which unlocks business capability and strategic value. And so, we look at this kind of speed to market, ability to build production, actually set up new production as a critical piece of what we're trying to accomplish. And when we dig into the product, this is kind of the core of what we look at when we say that these workflows are broken. You see here, a binary diff. This is what a standard change management workflow would look like if you were looking at Rockwell code with Git, given that we have binary file types. So kind of the core to our product is making these workflows and these products that don't work with standard off-the-shelf IT tool chains work well, and in a way that's ergonomic. So you can see here, this is a visual diff, of the same code or similar code. Similarly, we often talk about DevOps. DevOps is the outcome of applying the most trusted principles from the domain of physical manufacturing leadership, the IT value stream. And it's very interesting because you look at DevOps as a set of practices that we're almost reintroducing to the industrial automation world, but it came out of lean theory of constraints, the Toyota production system, et cetera. So you kind of see the circling of knowledge between the IT and OT space. But when we talk about DevOps for IT, it kind of enables, faster workflows. It enables, more scale of your engineering teams. And we often talk about the IT DevOps approach. And so that starts with Git-based source control and collaboration, which gets to faster recovery, automate testing, which enables you to catch issues earlier. Deployment management, we've actually talked to customers and say it takes them 3 months before they can deploy a change to production, even after they've made the change, because it's so painful to actually push changes in deployment, some more efficient deployments, and then observability and monitoring, more visibility to changes. So you can actually say, hey, our code is from the moment we finish writing it, it's reviewed, it's tested, it's deployed in a consistent way, and that we get observability and monitoring there. The lack of DevOps and OT, really we see, within the OT space, a lack of backups and outdated file storage. As I said, physical storage is the standard use case. That leads to extended downtime. We see manual testing in many cases, testing in production or testing during planned downtime. So, manual testing frameworks where things don't always get tested because it's so painful to test in production, and people don't run through every test that they should do. So ideally, we'd have more emulators, simulators, and automated testing, manual deployment. We see just changes are really expensive in this space, and limited observability. People don't really know what's changing in their environment. On top of this, as we've kind of moved along, we view industrial DevOps as a fundamental part of the industrial application layer. And we start to see this kind of pick up as you're building out your industrial stack. You'll build your networking, you'll build your edge infrastructure, you'll be building, network observability, all of this stuff. And then you have the industrial layer that sits on top of that, their MES, et cetera. But we view, as people are writing code in these environments, they're going to have to invest in DevOps in order to scale their production environments as we see increasingly automated production. And so and then we'll go through this pretty quickly because people should be familiar with this who've seen this before. Our goal is to power the future. And we say Industry X.0 because there's always a new version of it. They're really looking at Git-based source control and collaboration, bringing this automated testing, deployment management, observability monitoring, bring this whole DevOps stack to the industrial space is our vision, making this work across all of those different protocols and tool chains. And then increasingly, and we'll talk about this here, we see AI transforming the way that software engineers work. We think that it's aligned with our vision, trying to understand if the same improvements we see in the IT space, the software space are possible within the OT space, and start thinking about AI enabled workflows, which we'll talk about our initial approach to this today. But before we get into that, this is our platform today, focus hyper on source control, automated backup. This is our source control solution. So you can see these kind of visual code changes here. This is kind of the bread and butter of a good source control practice. Commit graphs, helping people understand what's changing, who's changing what in their environment. And then our other core product that often is useful in the end user market and people who sustain production is automated backup and disaster recovery, which is increasingly par for the course within industrial environments, especially as we see IT and OT converging, CIOs and CISOs taking over these environments, and even regulatory requirements in Europe. There's a requirement to understand what has changed in your plant floor and to have good backups. So I think we'll see broad adoption of backup solutions over the next 5 to 10 years. It's just a necessary requirement in most production environments at this point. So if you're not already investing in this, I think it's something that's worth looking into and just getting ahead of as a team. And additionally has the benefit of solving for manual backup processes, which a lot of people do, and letting you start moving on your DevOps mission. So you can see here some of the visual job history and dashboards. Finally, it's worth calling out because people bring it up all the time is security. I mean, we're SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, and we invest heavily in security as a business, given that these environments are have critical information and oftentimes critical IP for our customers. Obviously, we've been through multiple enterprise IT audits and all of that stuff as well. So we dig pretty heavily into this, and I think cloud done right is actually a security win compared to a USB stick sitting at your desk where you're relying on physical security. So that's Copia today. And that's just a little bit of a breakdown of what we're doing in 10 minutes. Anything in there that you think that you have any questions on before we jump into the AI for industrial code piece?
No, I think that was especially the visuals, I think, and again, for anybody listening, this is the third or fourth time we've had Copia on. So we've gone through these slides before, but I think the visuals really kind of followed with what you were saying, gave a really good understanding of why Copia exists and what you guys do. And I think that was a great summary and recap. And I'm excited because I've already read the press release. I'm excited to get into part 2 of the show here to talk about what you guys are doing with AI, which I think the audience will be very excited about. So let me turn it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one thing as we jump into this section too is we're not, as a business, we made the decision not to do AI for AI's sake. But since we've seen it have so much impact within software and engineering, a lot of people should say that's the kind of biggest area of impact for AI was code generation, all these tools. We thought it was worth investing in because if it's transformative in that space, it's potentially transformative in the OT space. And that's what kind of kicked this off and got us saying that this might be something that's really, really valuable. And we think we've built something that will have a big impact on engineers' workflows as a product that we hope people can use every day. So I'll hand it over to Nick to introduce himself and talk a little bit about the product.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Like I mentioned at the top of the podcast, my name is Nick Buckley, technical product manager here at Copia. I've been with the company for almost a few years now, almost 3. And a little bit more about my background. I'm an electrical engineer by education who found myself in the industrial automation and controls industry pretty early on in my career. And so I followed the progression as a controls engineer doing your traditional controls development for a custom machine builder OEM here in Minnesota. Worked my way up to managing the team at that company, which is where I got introduced to Copia because one of my first projects I wanted to take on was fixing our source control problem, or really lack thereof. After that, moved to Copia and started out as a technical solutions engineer within the sales organization, which was a great perspective for me to get to see, be on the other side of the user and talk to people day in and day out about the problems that they face and how they are looking for something like Copia to solve them. And then this year, I moved into the product management role, where I now help kind of drive the vision of the product direction, and have been fortunate enough to work on this exciting new project that we're here to talk to you about today. So we're here to talk about the launch of Copia Copilot, which is our AI for industrial code tool that we should have released by the time this podcast has gone out. So a little bit of background about this. Like Adam mentioned, AI does have a little bit of a buzzword sense, and here at Copia, we're very much against AI for the sake of AI. And so the core thing that we thought about when we started off and set off down this path was focusing our guiding light on, we need to solve problems and pains that our users face today. It needs to be something that people actually need to use, and not just something that's a cool demo. So we've been working with a handful of close customer partners over the course of the past few months in an alpha period, where we've been getting their feedback and having them try it out. And then this next phase is a beta for our cloud customers, to existing customers today, to use the tool in a free to use format for the duration of this. I'll obviously talk more in just a little bit about the capabilities of this, but given that Copia is a vendor neutral platform, we think we've got a unique position, especially related to this AI product, to have a tool that's usable across multiple vendors. Many of our customers at Copia have a variety of them that they're using and developing today. But we started out this project with the focus being first on the Rockwell and Allen Bradley ecosystem. And that's just primarily a function of the resources that we have. And we wanted to build something that was, again, meets the needs of the customers and solve those problems. So we're starting off with Allen Bradley and Rockwell, and hope to expand that in the future. So before we actually see it, I just want to preface one more thing about the capabilities of this tool. So for those of you who are familiar with using LLM tools like ChatGPT, the space of possibilities is pretty broad. There's a lot of things that you can do. So we try to categorize, at least at the outset, 3 categories that we expect people to use this tool in. And those are the following. So the first one is what we call net new code generation. This is kind of in a vacuum, you need to generate a piece of code. Maybe it's an AOI for interfacing with a new piece of equipment, or something of that nature. The next one is code modification, which is similar to the first one, but it's different in the sense that you already have an existing body of work. You already have a program that you want to modify, and you want to make changes and improvements to that. And we'll see some examples of this, but the interesting thing and distinction about code modification that we found from talking to these alpha partners is that it's not enough that the code that is generated is correct, meaning it does what you've asked it to do. It's also pretty important that it looks like the code that you're using, because people tend to standardize their code to assist with ease of maintenance and just usability across the organization. And then the final one is just kind of the traditional conversational question and answer and code interpretation. I kind of think of this section as a digital controls engineer colleague that you can ask questions of. And what we'll show here in a little bit is the capability of the tool to look at your code that you give it, your PLC code, understand it, and ask questions and suggest improvements and things like that. So with that, we've prepared a few demo slides here. Just to preface this, these are all real prompts and real responses that the Copia Copilot has given to us. This first one is really focused on that conversational Q&A. So in this example, my prompt is, give me a brief summary of this program and its contents. Now, why would this be useful? Well, I get a few stories of when this could potentially be something that you'd want to use. The first one is, maybe you're a technician who's using Copia, and you've been tasked with troubleshooting some code. Maybe you're not familiar at the deep level that the controls engineer who wrote the code is with it. You don't necessarily feel comfortable making a lot of changes. With this tool, you can ask the Copilot, hey, what's going on in this, to help you get kind of a lay of the land really quickly and easily without you going through hundreds of lines of code and rungs of ladder logic. The other kind of example where you could imagine using this is a very common use case is you're a company who has deployed a machine, or it's one of your previous deployments within your own company that needs service or needs an upgrade. Perhaps that original engineer no longer exists at the company or just otherwise unavailable. You, again, want to be able to quickly get up to speed and identify the landscape of this project. So if you go to the next slide, we can see the result of this prompt. So it does what I asked it to. It gave me a brief, high-level description of all of them. So it's telling me, this program controls the conveyor system for moving around pies on our production lines. And then it goes through and enumerates all of the different routines that are there. So it tells me that the main routine calls other routines. The alarms routine is responsible for generating a heartbeat signal and monitoring for alarm conditions. So the value of this specific example is that you can very quickly become more familiar and comfortable with a foreign piece of code to you and get some questions answered at a high level.
And this is a big use case that we see comes up a lot. Oftentimes people in maintaining production, might not even read ladder logic or might have limited knowledge of that. So this is something that can often be very powerful, especially for people who are maintaining production environments and different people who aren't quite as skilled within automation or maybe have a different skill set but are still kind of responsible for some controls related stuff. So this is really cool. And the coolest part about this, honestly, has just been that it works so well, right? I think this is one of the ones, Nick, where you were like, this works really well when you initially started testing it here. So.
I want to just jump in too. I'm looking at the results here, and some of the things that it's telling me, I would not have guessed. For instance, there's a routine that doesn't have a very descriptive name, but your Copilot has deduced things from what's in that routine to give me kind of a summary of what's in there. And that can be helpful, especially if you have a lot of times the routine names, the program names aren't like user friendly. So by this going through and parsing out what's in there, that could quickly help me if I've not used this program before, maybe quicken my pace and find troubleshooting something, because I could say, okay, what I'm looking for is in that routine there. I would have never guessed the heartbeat would be in that routine. Why is it in that? I don't know, but it is. So now I can just jump in there and go look at it. Let me turn it back to you, Nick.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Shawn. At Copia, we've gotten pretty good at understanding these projects and having a close understanding of the structure. And with things like tag comments and rung comments and just naming of tags, these AI systems, these LLMs, are surprisingly good at piecing together all of that context and being able to tell a story. And the interesting thing and the surprising thing that we found is that even with projects that are pretty sparse when it comes to that additional context, like comments, it still does a pretty good job at being able to figure out and give it a best guess at what's going on.
Of course, you had to train it, you had to teach it. This is this, that is that. That's something you guys did uniquely with the AI and the model you built for it, that, if I went up to ChatGPT, it would have no clue what this program was. Am I correct in saying that?
In a sense. So in the true sense of training for LLM models, we are not truly training. So when you think of LLM foundational models, like I'm just going to use ChatGPT a lot because I think that's the most
one
popular.
everybody knows. Yep.
Exactly. True training involves massive data sets, GPUs, and training over the course of months. So what we're actually doing with Copia, and not to go too low level here, but we're using one of those foundational models that's been trained on a wide variety of data. And then we are giving it the tools and the additional context that it needs to know how to interpret and understand really what's kind of the mess of information that's in these files. And with that, it really kind of supercharges it and allows us to give a much better result within the context of the files that our customers are working on.
Yep. And then one subtle thing to call out here, we might have a slide on it later, is if you notice on the left, this selection window, this is integrated into our source control products or device links. So if you're backing up solutions or you have code in Copia, you can open up a repo and just ask it to summarize that repo for you. So that's another kind of powerful or a subset of the repo, because you see here it's the conveyor station that we're looking at. But I did want to just call out that piece as well, that there's that nice integration there. So
yeah, for those Studio 5000 users, it looks like the controller organizer on the left-hand side of the screen. If you're listening and not watching, we get the summary in the middle, but on the left it looks like the controller organizer, but it's inside of the Copia software.
Yeah. So it should be intuitive to navigate there. So it really gives people the opportunity to kind of navigate their own project files but then ask for this kind of natural language summary and then continue to iterate on that. So
we'll actually be able to see that project navigation in the next example. So let's go there. So this next one, this was actually prompted from some customer discussions that we've had with this alpha group. They asked, could it convert ladder logic to structured text or vice versa? And before we see what it does, I kind of want to give it some examples of why you might want to do that. So from my experience myself as a controls engineer, we've had customer projects that where the end user has a standard language. Maybe they only allow ladder logic because that's what their maintenance personnel are comfortable using. But our library is primarily structured text. You may just have kind of a company initiative to transition one way or the other. And sometimes one language versus the other is just easier to read as far as the flow of the code and troubleshooting. So to do this translation manually is doable. It takes a long time to do. It's quite tedious and it's error prone. It's not immediately obvious how to go from one to the other. And so what we'll see in this next slide in this video is an example of me asking the Copia Copilot to do this translation and the result of that. So first, we're showing an existing piece of ladder logic code within the Copia renderer. This is the Studio 5000 project. And this is the one that I want to convert to a structured text routine. And then now what we're looking at is the Copilot interface. And what we just saw, what Adam had alluded to in the last example, was since we're integrated into Copia, our users have these projects already stored within repositories today. And so instead of needing to find the file or export that routine and then upload it to the Copilot, we allow you to pick that directly from the same window, select it, and that's essentially the same as attaching it. And these types of small, subtle areas where we really focused on reducing friction are a very key point of the work that we've been doing in reducing that and making this a tool that's actually something that people feel happy and happy to use. So I've asked it to convert it. And what we see now is the Copilot is giving us first of all, it's going to give us a description about what it did. So it says, I've converted this from ladder logic to structured text. And then what we can see is a well-formatted structured text representation of that original sequence routine. And the neat thing is that the original comments, run comments are still retained. So it's not like it blew away those. And all of the original sequence numbers still exist. So it still can be used within the context of your project.
Yeah, I remember this is one when you first got it working, you were like, this is very cool. I remember you were pretty shocked that it was able to do this at this level of quality. So
yeah, and you can imagine if you were tasked with converting an entire library from one to the other, that could be a weeks-long endeavor. This can substantially increase the time to doing the conversion, and then not to mention the reduction in errors and issues when you've done that translation.
Guys, that was really cool. And so for the people who are listening, let's just take rung one, for example. We got like an XIC, and then branched around that, we have an XIC ONS, and then that leads over to a move. And so what would that look like in, I think we could all kind of visualize that in structured text, but we're doing an either or here. We have two instructions or these other two instructions, right? And so when we look at what it did an if statement like you'd expect, and we have open parentheses, and we have the first two operators, and then we have an or, and then we have another operator that matches the latter. So you can really follow along. It's in the same order as the ladder logic, and you can follow along. You see the run comments there are now comments inside of the structured text. And all Nick did to make this happen is he selected the routine he wanted to convert. He typed in, hey, convert this routine from ladder to structured text, and it did it. And Nick, am I missing anything here?
No, that's it. I mean, I suppose the one thing that I neglected to mention is what you do with this after you got the result, after you see it on your screen. And that's something also that we identified really early on as being a pain point. Since we can't integrate with the IDE itself, we've got to do everything we can to reduce the friction of getting the results to actually accomplishing the final task, which is getting that code on the device and doing the thing that you want. So a couple of things that we've done to make that easier is, first of all, with structured text, it's just text. You can copy and paste it like you would. So you can copy it and paste it directly into your IDE. But the other things that we can do with Copilot is download the L5X and an importable L5X. So if for whatever reason you wanted to do that way, you'd be able to download it, right-click, import in Studio, and add it that way. And then with results that are generated in ladder logic, we've actually we've done a lot of work to make that easier as well, because that's a little bit trickier because it's not just text. And you can, within Copia today, select multiple rungs of Rockwell's ladder logic, click a button to copy it, and then in your IDE, you can paste that as neutral text, and they'll get created down there. And so that's about as good as we can get without being in the IDE itself for making that transition from the Copilot to the actual IDE.
Yeah, and this is, again, I mean, we mentioned earlier that while we're a multi-vendor product, we picked one vendor to begin with, but where we really dug in, and Nick and the team really dug in, was trying to make sure that these workflows were ergonomic. And again, it's that hyper focus on, can we build workflows that actually work for the people who are using the product? So those small things like, how do you get code out of the Copilot into the IDE? We spent a lot of time on those sorts of things because we wanted to make sure that we really nailed the workflow and made sure that it worked well for the users of the product, and the very intense customer-centric, user-focused conversations we had with our alpha customers helped us kind of smooth out those rough places in the workflow. Because if people had to then redo all of this stuff in Ladder and Studio 5000, it was going to be painful. But if they could copy and paste, it was going to be a lot easier.
Okay, so this next one's a fun one. And there's been a lot of examples of this as we've worked on this project of things that our users have asked that we can do. And the answer was originally, we don't know, but we'd love to try it. And so one of our one of the alpha users had this problem where his team was responsible for writing, maintaining, and distributing the company's library of standardized code. So they would write AOIs that controlled their, communication with a database, for example, or controlling a robot. The thing that they were missing, though, is that they didn't have the bandwidth and the time to actually do the final step of documenting these pieces of code with essentially like an instruction manual. And the result of that is when people don't have the instructions, people are not as likely to follow those standards, but it just didn't really rise to the level of them investing a bunch of an engineer's time to write documentation. And I know I don't like writing documentation. I suspect that a lot of the engineers in the audience don't either. So what we were able to do, and we're going to see here next, is within Copilot, we're able to ask it to write a document describing the purpose of the AOI, the intended behavior, any requirements such as inputs and outputs, and put it into a nice format. And so what we're going to be putting in here in this example is a markdown formatting, which is just a nice way of formatting text. What we see here, this is again that project tree. So I have my Studio 5000 project in my Copia repository, and I selected the AOI that I wanted to generate the documentation for. In this case, it's an alarm AOI that I'm sure many people have interacted with something similar. So then continuing on, we asked it to generate that documentation. And what we see at the end of this is a list of text of that documentation. Now, this has some weird kind of icons. That's the markdown formatting syntax. So what the video is showing now is us putting this into Copia so we can actually see that formatting. And this is how that user ultimately wanted to store this documentation, because within Copia, it's right next to the code. What we're seeing is a really nicely formatted and well-structured document that starts off with, here's what this AOI is intended to do. Here's a list of inputs that are needed, including the data type. So it's calling out that the input alarm condition tag is a Boolean, and then the alarm time is a double integer, which is representing the number of milliseconds for the debounce for triggering the alarm. And it even gives us later down the line an example usage of that AOI in structured text. All of this is from one prompt that you can reuse and ask for any and all of your pieces of code within the project.
I was just going to say, for the audio audience, we saw that markdown language. It was all just text, right? With the extra characters that you may not normally see in a text file. But what those extra characters did was defining the font size, was defining the, should it be bold, was defining, hey, is it a ordered list or is it a bulleted list? And even if it's a code sample, which would, shows up in a different, with a different color background. And it looks beautiful. And I know if you gave me this AOI and said, Shawn, create this document from this AOI, I'd be like, I would get a headache immediately. It's like, I don't want to do that. I want to do something productive. So having the AI tool be able to generate this just from all the work I've put into my AOI, I've gone in there, I've described everything, I annotated everything, having the ability for your Copilot to be able to create this documentation on it is pretty huge. I'm just very impressed. It looks so professional.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice when the capabilities allow you to kind of offload some of the tasks that are not as fun to do as an engineer, like documentation. So it's a great capability, I think.
Yeah, we saw a customer sit with this for 3 hours and generate an AOI for every single documentation for every single AOI, just like this. So it's a really powerful way of building more documentation. And then even if you're not the owner of the AOI and you're consuming the AOI, being like, how do I use this AOI? You can go ask, our Copilot that, and it will return, this is how you use it. So it's useful both if you're the owner of the AOI or if you're given this thing that you're supposed to use and you don't know how to use it, right? So, and there's no documentation. So it kind of filled the gap there and help people be more productive.
Yeah, and it's not easy to look at a AOI. You don't when you look at AOI, you don't see this beautiful document, right? It's a piece of code, and it can be everybody knows it's time consuming to read somebody else's code, right? So even the best developed AOI doesn't give you this level of, ease of use. You could actually read this and say, "Oh, I feel pretty comfortable with that AOI now." So I would like to know what you in the audience think. Are you impressed like I am? What are your thoughts on this? Let me know. Leave a comment on the show. Send me get in contact with me. I'd like to know what you guys think about this as well. And let me turn it back to you, Adam.
Yeah, there's one thing here too. I'm just seeing the second bullet under limitations, which says the AOI does not provide built-in alarm acknowledgement or latching functionality. These would need to be implemented externally if required. I don't know how it figured that out. It's pretty cool. It's pretty powerful. Should we go to the next slide?
Yeah. Yeah. So the next couple of slides are going to be on the code generation, a little bit more depth on that. So this one's going to be this is that net new generation. So from scratch, generate me a piece of code. And so what we're going to ask it to do here is generate me just a template routine of a basic sequencer, of which most companies will have this concept of a sequencer. You might write it in ladder logic, you might have it in structured text. What I'm asking you to do is just generate me an empty one as a boilerplate, and leave the rest empty. And I'm specifying that this sequence should start on a specific input tag, and then it should also restart automatically when it finishes all the steps. An additional kind of wrench to throw in there, I asked it to stop immediately if there's any alarms or faults, and then I told it to only use native Studio 5000 instructions, so it doesn't use try to add any AOIs or custom instructions. And this type of thing, I see being as a very helpful capability for especially new engineers. When I started out as a controls engineer, well, really as an intern, my first project was tasked with translating an existing project from Rockwell to a Beckhoff system. And I didn't have any training. I was just sat down, looked at the code, and needed to email coworkers asking questions and just kind of slog through it. And with this capability, you can kind of more quickly get that level of proficiency, and with the additional benefit of not needing to sit next to and pester a more senior engineer. So if we go to the next slide, we can actually see this demonstrated. And this would be a quick one because I'm not selecting any project to begin with. I'm just giving it the prompt as input. And then what we look at here is the output. And if we scroll to the top, Adam, just pause when it gets there, please. So we see a 10 or so rungs, and it has an output of this ladder logic routine, and then down below it has a description of what it's doing. But we can see here that on the first rung, it's saying if the start signal has been given, or if the sequence is completed, it's coming back around, and there's no alarms, we're going to kick it off. And then we also see that it meets my other requirement of if there's any alarms present or any faults present, we're going to take the sequence out of running mode so that it stops. And then for the future steps, it did what I had asked and said, just make the steps as a placeholder, but don't have any actions within them. Just leave them blank so I can fill them out later on down the line. So to kind of continue on that, this next example is
Next.
going. Yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah, one thing just to add real quick too is the rendering itself in the browser, right, of the generated code. This is something that we invested in early in the process. Is we said, hey, if we're going to build a code generation tool for ladder logic, it needs to actually generate visual code. And so this is something that isn't anywhere else on the market as far as we're aware. And we thought is kind of a par for the course. It's kind of back to this idea of making the IT DevOps vision ergonomic in the OT space. The initial binary file diff has been kind of core of what Copia is doing, is having this code generation actually also be visual. So I just want to call that out because I think we're used to it now, Nick, but it was
Yeah,
actually, that was a big step for us when we started this project was, can we generate code that we can then, render in the browser so that people can actually have they can actually use the product.
Yeah, that's a good call out, because if you're not able to see it quickly and instead you have to kind of round trip to the IDE to verify it and then come back, iteration, asking it to make changes and improvements to the results that it made is really, really slow and kind of diminishes the value. So this is very, very important that you can actually see the results in a format that resembles the final format. So we continue on this example by asking it to now modify that code. And this is kind of I think an interesting demonstration of the capabilities, because what I'm asking it to do, and I think it's a slightly different sequence routine, but same structure. I ask it to add an additional step, somewhere between step 200 and 300. And I give it a little bit more information and say that step should not continue unless the station alarmed bit is not true. So on the next slide, what we can see is the code of that routine before the change. If you go to the next slide, please, Adam. So it might be a little hard to see, but on rung 4, we see sequence step 200, and on 5, we see 300. And based on my instructions, I want an additional one in between those two steps. And go to the next one, please. So then highlighted in red now is that newly added rung. And you'll notice that it picked the sequence step of 250, so kind of split the difference there. And it did actually check that the station alarm bit is not true before continuing. And worth pointing out too is I didn't ask it to add a comment to that rung, but it actually did say there's a comment on the rung that says check if the station is not alarmed before proceeding. It kind of has the ability to make those additions and insertions, especially related to code commenting, when appropriate, and in this case, it certainly was. So I think I just have a couple more examples. So this one's a unique one where I'm asking it to generate a UDT. So I wanted to show this to demonstrate that it's not just code generation or logic generation in the traditional sense. I'm asking it to write a UDT, which is essentially a custom data type for Studio 5000. And I've asked it to do for a recipe that's representing an oven control process. I say it should contain elements around temperature, target temperature, TID values, and errors, but I give it a lot of latitude to add any additional parameters that I'm not thinking of. Now, is this the most realistic example? I don't know. I've never done an oven control, but I'm guessing that if you're someone who does, you probably have a very good sense of those types of values and controls that you want. But that does not prevent you from specifying specifically, saying, I want a temperature value named X and on. But this is just, it shows that it's kind of has some ability for creative thought and kind of filling in the blanks there. So if we go to the next slide, I think this is a video demonstration of me asking it. And once we get the response, Adam, we'll just ask you to pause that, please. Once I get to the UDT. So the interesting thing is, since we've tied this in with our kind of core source control and rendering technology, you'll notice, Shawn, that the project tree, just like you called out earlier, which resembles the Studio 5000 logic tree, shows us the list there, and it shows us the UDT in the location that it would be normally. And I can click on that and see a UDT with 7 or 8 tag elements in there. And then continuing on, Adam, you'll even notice that I didn't tell it to give me a good description, but it is kind of one of the things that we've done is really biased it towards being a thorough controls engineer. And we notice here that the cooldown rate tag, they added the comment, Copilot added the comment that says, this is the cooldown rate in degrees Celsius per minute. And each and every one of them has that.
Yeah, that's super cool. We love a rigorous AI. That's super exciting.
And this final example is a real life example from my previous experience as a controls engineer. It's a net new generation where my company had a standard piece of code for controlling those tower lights that you'll often see on top of machines with the green, yellow, and red lights. But our end customer had a different behavior of those lights, where they wanted the red light should flash, with a 50% duty cycle when the machine is experiencing an alarm. And the yellow light should be on when the machine is not actively running. So what I do in this prompt is specify the behavior. And had I had Copilot back then, I probably could have just copy and pasted the requirements that they had listed down in their requirements document and asked it to implement this. But I go ahead and ask the Copilot to generate this AOI. And what we're going to see on the next slide is, I believe, a video demonstrating that. So I give it a long, maybe not long, but I give it a good, thorough explanation of what I want. And the result of that is a simple piece of code that represents the routine that's doing controlling those lights and the behavior of them, just as I had described. I don't know if you maybe can go there and pause that, Adam, so we can just take a look.
Yep.
So if we look at rung 0, the green light is on when there's not an active alarm. And we see that the red lights on rung 2, as well as the alarm, both get activated and start flashing when there is an alarm active within the program. So this has saved me some amount of time, maybe 10 minutes to write this up and change it. And I can, just like I mentioned earlier, import that directly into the project and start using it immediately.
Yeah. Great. Anything else on that? And then I can add one or two other things just for people's consideration as they're thinking about using and engaging with the tool.
No, I think that's it. Hopefully those examples kind of demonstrated some of the possibilities and capabilities of the Copilot tool. And we're really excited to see all of the new ones that people come up with when they start using it.
Yeah, it's been honestly, I think on my end, as we've built this out and I've been watching you and the team engage with this, and the tool is kind of understanding, what's, and also the early alpha customers is, what can this tool do well, what can it not do well, and starting to feel that out. I think one really interesting thing too that we saw across different customers is there's a learning curve associated with some of these tools as well. So you notice that some of these prompts are really well structured and all of this stuff as well. That same learning curve, I think sometimes people think they run into these sorts of learning curves. They're like, oh, we're just experiencing this for the first time, or it's on the platform. A lot of those learning curves exist within software GPT as well. So when you're generating Java or C# or whatever, you often see you have to structure the code the right way and send the right sort of prompts in order to get the result you want. So there is kind of a learning curve that people go through with this. So as people adopt the tool and use it, just kind of keeping that in mind of this is what well-structured prompts look like, and the result will be better based off the quality of the actual prompt that you put in. The other thing I just want to call out here is in terms of how these tools get used is, like, we don't provide a guarantee that the code works on the first code generation. You still have to bring it into Studio 5000 and test it. You might modify the code and do some things a little bit different, but the goal there is to get you an 80% improvement. So, how do you, the sequencer example is one I think about where you're like, this is repetitive code to write. Let's just get it going, and then I can kind of go from there. And that's similar to how code generation gets used in the software space. People generate some code and they'll bring it into their project, but then they still have to adapt it to the project and the environment they're in as well. So I just want to call some of those things out. As people come to the tool, it's a goal. The goal is to speed you up, to bootstrap repetitive code, or building out a UDT is a great example of this, and make it so that you can actually just move a lot faster. And that's why you see that, sometimes we'll say even 30-40% productivity improvement for software engineers using, code automation. So all of this stuff, is goal is to make it so that you're more productive and able to do more work as an engineer, whether you're sustaining production, you need the documentation, the natural language, and the AOI documentation, or you're developing new code from scratch. This is really powerful, and thanks for demoing that, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was great. I can definitely see it's easier to type in, create a UDT that does this, this, and this, than it is to actually go in the GUI and create it all, manually. So especially like if you have to create 200 rungs and it's going to be a sequence like you had there, it would be easy to say, hey, create this 200 run program that does X, Y, and Z, and just have it generate the code. That's a lot of typing that you didn't have to do, because it understood what you wanted and it did all the work. It's almost, analogous to what we did, 20 years ago when, we just, people discovered Excel, or maybe it's 30 years ago. And they're like, I can just click the corner and drag and it fills it, auto-populates everything. So
Yeah.
it really just is a super usability and time saver for our engineers who are being asked to do more and more every day. So let me turn it back to you, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think the time saver, I mean, for me, when I was a software engineer and writing code every day, I used to always say there's a lot of manual labor involved with just typing all the things you need to type. And some of that work is actually not the most exciting part of the role. It's often exciting to figure out, how do I translate this process I was given into a overall cohesive system, and hopefully enables people to be more highly leveraged, and be doing more impactful and exciting work in their day-to-day workflow as well, as opposed to writing boilerplate, So.
Yeah.
Cool. Just kind of roll this out, more outcomes, thinking about DevOps, kind of bringing back the overall DevOps story. We work with customers across the, across almost every industrial vertical, from packaging and distribution to, discrete to water treatment, utilities, et cetera. Like we work across, a bunch of different industrial verticals, hundreds of customers. And as I mentioned, our goal is really to deliver value to those customers and make sure that we are having substantial impact there. Again, where we try and differentiate in the market is to be able to have a standardized workflow that integrates across every vendor. And a lot of the core work we do is integrating with additional vendors. So, with this Copilot product, we're starting with Rockwell, but assuming that we get to a workflow that works really well with Rockwell, then we want to kind of spread those and scale them to other vendors. And then, again, we see results in these cases. This is a public case study with Amazon: reduction in unexpected downtime due to code error, reduction of resolution time for severe code issues. So we see this actual impact of adopting these practices. And we work, across different industrial horizontal verticals. So we work in basically almost every industrial vertical. And then again, we've worked with a variety of customers. So we see, impact on output, impact on workflow. Copia has been life-changing. AWC as an amazing customer, saying it is a part of our daily operations, using the product every day. A couple of hours per person per week, we often hear with our source control products. So, we can see across all of these great customers that we work with, incredible impact in their day-to-day workflows, and enables you to do more with your controls engineering team as you're adopting these practices. And we're hoping AI is even more of an accelerator as people really dig in and start to figure out how to use code generation productively in their workflows, manage to use documentation to learn the code and set context more quickly so they can onboard into projects more easily. We're hoping that we see and then also using our tool to modify their code and actually develop. So it's super exciting, and we're hoping this becomes another piece of this overall story of impact. So with that, any other questions or any other kind of thoughts that you have as we're digging through this?
I would just say that it sounds like from the beginning of the show that if somebody is a customer, that they're going to have access to the beta. Is that correct?
Yep. So our open beta is launching in a week or so. I guess it will be launched by the time people are listening to this. And if you already are a Copia customer, you have access to our open beta immediately for free in your product. The reason that we're doing an open beta, again, we keep talking about customer centricity, solving real problems. We want to see this as a product that people can use every day. Our existing product, we track stickiness index, which is of people that use our product every month, how many are using every day. And we see, a third of our customers who will use the product once in a month are using it every day. It's an indispensable part of their workflow. And so we want to see that same level of stickiness and engagement with this tool to know that we really solved a problem for people before we worry about, how do we monetize or any of that stuff. It's really focused on, are we building something that is valuable, and is solving a real problem.
So it sounds like if you're potentially a large customer, you could have some influence on, as the alpha customers have already, some influence on this product and how it's developed through its beta stages. So if this is something you're looking for, guys, please get in touch with the folks over at Copia, and they'd be happy to work with you on that. Adam and Nick, was there anything else you wanted to cover?
Yeah, I'll add, if you're not a Copia customer and you're really interested in using this tool, still reach out, right? We can probably figure something out. So our goal is really to learn and work, in a close way with users and customers. And as I said, make sure we're solving real problems and that we're bringing a tool that adds real value. So don't hesitate to reach out. That's why we're talking about this publicly.
Well, guys, I want to just thank you again for coming on the show and going through this exciting new product. I really love where you're going with this, and I really appreciate you coming on the show again to show a new product to our audience. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This is always a really fun show, and it's great to be able to go deep on the product, and we really appreciate the questions and thoughtful insights.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode, and I want to thank Adam and Nick for coming on the show to tell us all about their new Copilot AI that they're integrating into Copia. And if you're a cloud customer, of course, you can try that out right now. And I want to thank Copia, too, for sponsoring this episode, making it ad-free. Wasn't that great? No ads? You guys know I love it when they're ad-free because not only do you guys don't have to listen to ads, it kind of pays for our person to edit them. Otherwise, it's really a complete loss. So thank you to them. And I want to thank our members who help keep our shows going. Really appreciate you guys. And I'll just thank all of you listeners. If you did enjoy this episode, please give us a like, a sub, and a share. And if you're on the audio platforms, please consider giving us a 5-star review because that really helps us grow the audience. And you guys heard this before, helps us find new vendors to come on the show. And I'm still running into vendors who've never heard of the Automation Podcast. So I really appreciate you guys spreading the word. And with that, we are on our reduced holiday hours, just trying to get through all the commitments. I'm just one guy, so I've got to complete all the commitments I have for 2024 to all my great vendors and customers. And so I'm working on those, and we do have more shows like this coming. We have more podcasts already recorded, so we're not going to leave you blind. I got another great show coming out tomorrow. It's an episode of The Automation Show where I show you how to convert Slick 500 programs to the brand new tool. Probably a tool you guys have never seen before. So check that out. That is a video over at the Automation blog and on YouTube. And with that, I just want to wish you guys all an awesome week. I want to wish you good health and happiness. And until next time, my friends, peace.